Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Jaime Rivera. Uh, I am proud to begin this discussion. Tonight, we're going to have the first meeting with Dr. Anita Perez Ferguson. Uh, and we have 4 students with us who are going to introduce themselves. And they're going to ask a few questions of her. So I'm going to ask Komori to begin talking about who he is, and then we will talk about the other panelists.
Hi, my name is Kamari Davis. I am a social work major with a minor in psychology. I'm one of the student representatives for the Council of Diversity and Inclusion. Next, I will pass the introduction to Grace. Grace graduated GCU in spring of 2020 with a BA in English with a minor in integrative health. Grace, would you like to say a couple words?
Hi, yes. So as you said, I did graduate with a BA in English last spring. And the redo commencement was just this past weekend. And I also graduated with a minor in integrative health. So yes. And I'm gonna pass along to Alyecia now.
Hi, my name's Alyecia. I am a psychology major who will be graduating in 2022. I'm currently a junior. I will now pass it to Eliana.
Hello, my name is Eliana Garcia. I'm a sophomore here at GCU and I'm a nursing major. And I am a part of a few clubs at GCU, and I just started with Dr. Rivera in this new program for Hispanic and Latino students. I think it's going really well, so yeah.
Yes, the program that Eliana is talking about is a program called Avanzando through college. It consists of 12 different workshops throughout 1 year. And we explore different topics that students need in order to succeed in college. So far, we have completed 1 workshop plus the introductions, and it's a good way of incentivizing students to stay in college and to continue. So I'm trying to stay a little longer and to give some time because Dr. Perez Ferguson is having a few issues right now to log in. I didn't want to hold people who are waiting to begin. So and we'll begin just in a few seconds. So before, so people don't wait forever. While we wait for Dr. Perez Ferguson, can you tell us a little bit about how you prepare the questions that you're going to ask her? Anybody?
I can answer that question. I did my research on Dr. Perez Ferguson. I wanted to see all of her long history, not only in politics, but in her leadership roles exactly. I wanted to see how she applied those leadership roles and how versatile she was throughout all of her positions.
I prepared my questions based on kind of the questions I looked at from the other panelists. I noticed that they asked questions that I was kind of thinking of. So I went a different way and asked like some personal questions mixed with some political questions.
I also did some research on Dr. Anita Perez Ferguson and based my questions off of that, such as her political roles in her career and how she wrote a book on speaking and women. So things like that.
And here she is, Anita Perez Ferguson. So thank you everybody for waiting a couple of minutes, and thank you for your patience. So who's going to conduct the first few questions?
Thank you for being here, everybody. I hope you had a good dinner. Did you get something to eat? Yeah? I know it's an awkward time, but I'm happy to answer any questions or talk about anything you wish. So feel free, and I'm eager to hear what you have to ask.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It really is quite a privilege to have you here. So my first question for you is, when did you become interested in politics, and what inspired you to become involved in the political atmosphere?
Okay. Well, it's not one magic moment in time. As happens is the longer our lives get, we return to things again and again. When I was preparing to talk with you tonight, I realized that when I was first involved in politics was during the Vietnam anti-war protests, way back, right? And I was very active through my college years when I was your age, doing those protests and going to meetings of all sorts. After I graduated and started working, then later got married, I was not as involved at all. I had all my career stuff and graduate school that I was working on. So it was decades later, that I actually was in another country when I got interested in re-engaging in our politics here in the US. I was working as a volunteer in East Africa. And at the time I was working in a refugee camp and seeing the severe limitations that the 40,000 people were in this one camp by the Juba River in southern Somalia. And it just occurred to me that we ought to be having better decision-making going on. That first of all, doesn't force the evacuation of so many refugees. Secondly, provides better treatment of people when they are sent away from their homes. All of those really life and death issues. And that's when I got engaged again in politics. And that was in the mid 80s, essentially.
Thank you so much. My name is Grace, by the way.
Hi, Grace.
I'm,
I'm sorry. Hi, my name is Eliana Garcia. I'm a sophomore here at GCU and a nursing major. I wanted to start off with just like a little bit of a more simple question. Just what are some of your favorite activities to do in your free time, and like, you know?
No problem, Alyecia. A lot of them are curtailed, as they say, or cut off now because of our severe restrictions. But I am actually a Zumba instructor, okay? And it's not easy, believe me, getting the licensing and training to do that. I did that about 10 years ago. And I love working with people with music, especially Latin music. It's really, really fun. It's good for my body. It's good for my spirit. It's good all the way around. Now, my sisters and I also have done a series of long distance walks, not races, but walks, like Walk for the Cure and the Leukemia Lymphoma group, and all of these different walks that go anywhere from 5, 10, half marathons. I've never done a full marathon, but half marathons to help raise money for disease prevention and cure. Those two things are a lot of fun. We used to shop and eat a lot, and we decided, well, maybe we ought to do something else besides that. So those are really fun things that I do. And now I do a lot more reading for fun. I didn't used to, but I do now. Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting, especially the Zumba. I love Zumba, so
well,
I think that's really,
maybe later in the week we can get a group going here.
it's super fun. I think it's a great exercise. So
it's a great exercise, really, really fun. Yeah,
that's very interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Kamari. I'm a social work major.
Uh-huh.
My question is, what values do you hold near and dear to your heart?
Mhm.
And did these values come from your upbringing, or did you just realize that this is what you value?
Well, Kamar, did they come from my upbringing or not? I think of them as gifts, okay, the values that I have. And yes, I had a great upbringing. I had a loving family. I was one of those lucky people. I had both parents with me the whole time growing up, and siblings and lots of cousins, a big extended Mexican American family in the east side of Los Angeles. So that's a big value, family value, of valuing not only your immediate family, but your ancestors, as well as thinking about the next generation. But I would say that the even more precious than that is my faith. And my religious faith is particularly important to me in making sense of the world around me, making sense of why I make one decision or another. And it has, in the same way that I have grown through my education and my political experience in my writing, I would say that the way that I interpret and live out my religious faith has also changed over the course of my life. And it's the primary value that I have in my life.
Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Hi, so I have Grace again. I have another question.
Sure, Grace.
So who do you find to be one of the most influential speakers of our time, and why do you think so?
Well, I'm going to, shame on me, name two men. Okay. And I will come back with some women, but I have to admit that two older men, one an African American, one a Latino man, have always impressed me with their speaking. Henry Cisneros is the Latino, and Henry, at his highest appointed position, was the Secretary of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, for President Clinton. And Henry comes from San Antonio. He was the mayor there at some point, and he's he's an educator, an entrepreneur, government leader, and he speaks beautifully. He speaks down to earth. In Spanish, you say de la gente. He speaks directly to the people, but he speaks really intelligently as well. Okay. So, and our former governor, I have to go back to another person. It's a Californian politician. Willie Brown is his name. And he can just knock your socks off as a speaker. It's like almost like a preacher, that really gets wound up. And then he comes all the way, he takes you all the way up. And then he says, but that's never going to happen unless we do this. And then he gives you real facts and figures. Here's our next step. And I love that combination of really being enthusiastic and driving the crowd, and then giving them very specific actions to take on them. It'd be great. Now, Sonia Sotomayor, our Chief Justice, is also an excellent speaker. I have really enjoyed her, and she's got that same combination actually that both of those people have. She speaks to the people very directly in the way that Cisneros does. And she also, as a judicial power, has a fabulous command of very specific legal steps and terms in the way that Willie Brown did as well. So Sonia is probably another one, and I'm sure I'll think of others when we're done tonight, but I'll name those three first.
Thank
How
you
about
so
you? Do
much.
you have a favorite speaker?
Oh, wow. Honestly, Dr. Martin Luther King. I know that's a classic, and I understand that might be a cliche answer, but
No.
his speeches they rock me. Like they are just so pivotal to me.
No, you can't go wrong there. Totally inspirational. And that's what's missing for a lot of people. That's what's missing for our candidates right now, unfortunately. But it's that ability to inspire the best in us. That makes a really great speaker. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Alyecia,
Hi,
I think
Dr.
you're muted.
Perez.
Hello. What can I answer for you, Alyecia?
I just wanted to introduce myself and ask you a question. I'm the vice president of LASSO and also the president of Psychology Club. And I wanted to ask you, what was your leadership style when serving as the Inter-American Foundation chair?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Alyecia. And I know I'm going to be with a couple of the groups that you're leading during the week again, so I look forward to that. The IAF, or the Inter-American Foundation, as we call it in Washington, D.C., I don't think I've ever been asked that question before. That's a good one. I'll give you a little background and then tell you what the style was and why. I came out of that, or came into that, as I was leading the National Women's Political Caucus, also in Washington, D.C. And the unique aspect of that is that the caucus has always been a bipartisan organization. And that's less and less common in anywhere, much less Washington, D.C., which means we had Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Green Party members, you name it. There were all sorts of people in that organization, and we were promoting all sorts of people. But we had certain benchmarks if we were going to promote their candidacy. So giving that background immediately and stepping into the chairmanship for the IAF, which has half of its board Republican, half of it Democrat, and gets a lot of its funding from the United States Congress, my leadership was definitely bipartisan leadership. And that meant not only did I have to be aware of the party platforms on either side of the aisle, as they say, or the independents, but I also had to kind of curb myself sometimes if it wasn't a personal belief that I held, or if I felt frustrated by roadblocks along the way. That it was very, very important for the organization, for the board first, for the organization secondly, but more importantly, for all the people throughout Latin America that benefited from the services of the Inter-American Foundation, that I not go off on a tangent or be one-sided. I really needed to be even-handed and be bipartisan in that, which is what I took every caution to be.
Thank you so much.
You bet. I'll tell you a little story that's linked, I think, in my mind, linked to that. Since we know that we're not in the ideal political times right now, given the way that we interact with one another as residents and citizens here in the US, I'll tell you a short, very short story about one of the training groups I was working with, a group of women in Latin America, training them to be candidates. And I was very cautious again that I didn't, talk party politics, but just talk general campaign strategies, how to get elected and so forth. And it was a formal group that would break for tea, right? They'd have like we'd say a coffee break, they'd have a tea break a couple times a day. And when they did, I noticed that these all women audience, pretty much, a lot of the women in the front row would get up, and there were men sitting in the back of the room, and they would join them and go out and have tea in the lobby and come back in. Well, I mentioned that to them during the session privately. I said how nice it You could be joined here. I assume they were their husbands, that your husbands joined you today. That's terrific. Well, one of the women took me back to introduce me to the gentleman at the back of the room. And he opened his coat. You can't see it here, but he like opened his coat. He had an Uzi submachine gun under there. She says, these are our bodyguards. It says, when we come to a political training, our government knows it means we're going to run against them, in opposition to them. And so we don't just come to have tea and listen to you. We have to come with our bodyguards because we're a threat to the government by running for office. I was taken aback and realizing how serious it was, what we were engaged in. And then comparing that to me trying to be bipartisan with the Inter-American Foundation, I realized that that's small potatoes. I can be decent and civil and bipartisan. It's not as if I have to bring my bodyguard to be director of the board, whereas the people that I'm serving and I'm working with often do have to bring their bodyguards with them. I didn't mean to stop the conversation.
I was taken aback. Speaking of politics, we just, well, the confirmation hearings of Amy Coney Barrett just finished.
Yeah.
What do you think her appointment to the Supreme Court could mean for America, for minorities in America?
Well, it depends on how you take the calculation. The normal calculation is not good. Okay. From all we can tell about precedents set on her rather short time being a judge in other circumstances in her life, do not indicate that she is going to be progressive, do not indicate that she is going to remove herself from supporting larger corporate interests, things of that nature. So, c'est la vie. This is what's happening. This is what happens. As we say, elections have consequences. And who is elected to that Senate has a heck of a lot of consequences, and we've just witnessed that. Now, the opposition in the Senate could have done any number of things. They could have walked away and not participated in the process. Okay. They could have continued to try and find ways to interrupt, to be there and interrupt the process. And what it appeared to me they did, I don't have any big secret knowledge, but this is what I believe they did. They took an overall look at her performance. Each one of them took one piece of it in terms of her history and her judicial record and called it and put it in the public record as to what her responses or non-responses were, and then just had to go forward. They knew they didn't have the votes to stop it. So there you have it. Now, here's one thing they didn't do. At least I don't think they did it. They didn't beat her up. They didn't sour her so much. They didn't make an enemy of her. Okay. And I believe that Sonia and other people that are on the bench, that these judges have relationships with one another. I believe there's an opportunity to see some good things come out of it. Now, I'm probably one of the few people that believe that, but hope springs eternal from me. I'm glad they didn't beat her up like they could have. I'm glad they brought out her public record in front of the cameras and in the Senate records itself. I'm glad they stayed plain in the process and just didn't walk away from it just because they knew they couldn't win the vote. I think they did the best they could under the circumstances, and I'm hoping for the best in the future. In the same way that Scalia surprised us a number of times, and his relationship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg was very good in a bipartisan across the aisle way.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I would like to ask a question, Dr.
Yeah.
Ferguson. Um, what challenges did you face when being confirmed by the Senate for the U.S. Department of Transportation?
Okay, well, public record is the short term, but I have to explain what I mean when I say public record. So there used to be, under other White Houses, what we call a vetting process, where people that were being appointed to high office had all of their records, political, financial, professional, even personal records checked very thoroughly before they were appointed, to make sure that they were correct, they were the right person for that job. So in my public record, there were 2 or 3 things that never go away, okay? And they turned up in there. One of them was a campaign contribution that I got when I was running for the US House of Representatives. Are all sorts of regulations on money you can accept or cannot accept as a candidate. And I had received a check from a legal entity, which is Puerto Rico, a trust territory. Okay, a group in Puerto Rico wanted to support me, but they wrote the check out of the wrong account. Okay. So the straight term of it is, it's an illegal contribution if it came from the wrong account. Okay. Now, did my treasurer notice it was from the wrong account? No. So we went ahead and cashed the check, put it into our campaign coffers. And then later, the Federal Elections Commission called us on it and said, this check from this group is not a legal contribution. They wrote it from the wrong PAC, essentially, Political Action Committee. And so I think they wrote it for the one that was for the island, for Puerto Rico, and they needed to do it in a national PAC. Well, the headline, that's not that big a deal. You return it, you write it back to them, they write it again, blah, blah, blah. But the headlines that my opponent made out of it were horrible. Democratic candidate accepts illegal contribution from foreign entity. Okay, that's the headline. That's LA Times, that's San Francisco Herald, right? And that lives forever. So that was an example of one of the sorts of things that the people in presidential personnel that does all the vetting for appointees caught. And they said, what is this? And worse than that, the FEC doesn't just say, oh, well, you just need another check. No, they gave me like a $5,000 fine or something like that. And so then that's the next headline. Candidate required, found guilty and must pay fine to the Federal Elections Commission, for campaign infraction. So that's the sort of thing that you get mixed up in through some simple mistake, but sounds horrible, and you do all of the things to make up for it, but you can never erase those things. Mm-hmm. I did have other goofy things, like my friends and neighbors or family saying, I got a call from the FBI. Why did they call me from the FBI about you? Well, that's the standard procedure when you're vetting an appointee. The FBI interviews people that you know or have lived near or work with. And so it makes people nervous, quite frankly. Long answer to a short question. Sorry about that.
No, of course. That was so rich with information. Thank you so much.
No problem. It's rough, it's crazy, and it's rough. But it's also fascinating and worth it.
ask a question. This is
Okay.
Eliana.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask, so I see that like you have a bachelor's degree in communications, a master's degree in counseling psychology, and also an additional master's degree in management. So I just was wondering how you personally feel that this unique combination of education has allowed you to like make the strides that you've made in your life.
Okay. That's a good question. I'm pretty much a college counselor's nightmare, okay, having moved around the map like that. And overall, those degrees and the final PhD in organizational development, essentially, again, speak to my growth over the years. They were all spread apart, and I was always looking for just the right thing. I didn't want to put my time and effort and money into a degree that I didn't think was a good match. So when I was youngest, 20, 21, the communications degree to me, I didn't exactly know how I was going to use it, but I knew I was always a good speaker. Okay. So I thought, okay, I could do this. And I found it tremendously helpful, obviously wrote books about speaking. So that was how that first one came about and how it has served me throughout. Secondarily, I got the University of Santa Clara master's degree in counseling psychology, primarily for two reasons. One, people were always coming to me telling me their problems. I don't know if you're like that. Some people are like magnets for built-in counselors, in the dormitory or in the neighborhood or in the family. I was always hearing people's problems. I wasn't solving them. I was just hearing them. And I thought, well, I might as well be educated to really understand how to listen to people and how to work with individuals when they're telling you their issues. The second reason that I went there is because I had an office mate in one of my first jobs who had his master's degree in counseling psychology from that school. And he told me about it. And if it hadn't been for him, I might not have either taken the degree or taken it at that university, but I had an immediate personal contact that spoke to an interest that I already had. So I went ahead and got that and was very glad I did. I went through some really rough times, like mid-20s to mid-30s. And it was really helpful for me to have that background, and has served me a lot in working with groups of people, especially people I don't always agree with, to have that background. Thirdly, after I got that job, after I got that degree, I got a job back at my old undergraduate alma mater and counseling. But after a year, the president called me in and asked me to take over the admissions office and the registrar's office and the financial aid office. And it was very business related. And I said, I can do this, but I need to have a better undergirding, a better education in business practices. So I basically bargained with them that my employer at that time, that school, would pay for my second master's degree in business administration so that I could apply it to the work they were asking me to do to run the business side of things at that college. Now, it's worked well for me in a lot of different areas, of course, but that's how I ended up with that series of degrees.
Thank you for that. That makes it really puts it all together now.
Like I say, it was not a plan that I had from the beginning, believe me. I didn't even expect to go to college when I was in high school. So it's kind of goofy that I have done all these things. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Hi, Grace again. So I know you mentioned being president of the National Women's Political Caucus. So what experience did you take away from being president of that?
Well, I could speak about it in a couple of ways. I'm going to speak about it financially because it was running a national nonprofit with a number of affiliates in the States. So when I work on nowadays on boards for corporations or other nonprofits, I really understand the stresses and strains of the finances of that type of an organizational framework. Firstly, running a nonprofit is really tough, and understanding where and how you're going to get your revenue is one of the primary things that you have to do. I see all the time individuals get so excited about their mission and their cause and their purpose. That's good. You can't do it without that, but you also cannot do it without having a good financial basis to run your organization. And so that really, really impressed me, and we had to work real hard at that. Secondarily, if you have subsidiaries or affiliates like the California Women's Political Caucus or the Michigan Women's Political Caucus, you got to learn how to, as a national entity, work with your affiliates so that you've got a strong enough leadership for everybody to be marching in the same direction, but you give them enough independence so that they can deal with their local issues or their state issues. And that goes on just about every organization I can think of, whether it's a nonprofit or whether it is a corporate entity. And that's all of those are within the country. With the Inter-American Foundation, we're working with several countries and are trying to have strong leadership, financial undergirding, and a common agenda that goes across country lines. Those are big lessons to learn, and those are some that I learned at the National Women's Political Caucus.
Great, thank you so much. That was very, very insightful.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jaime, you have some great students here. I'm looking forward to meeting more of them as we go through the week.
Thank you, thank you. And I know they have more questions. I don't know if they're waiting for other people to go ahead. So.
National Women's Political Caucus. So I figured since we're on this topic, I could ask
Okay.
that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering, like, what steps did you take in order to become president? How did you get in that position?
Okay, well, this is a little bit like choosing my college career. Okay, so I'm going to tell you the story of the caucus. In 1983, maybe 84, I was working for another college in Massachusetts, and I was a fundraiser responsible for raising about $1 million or more every year from the alumni. And my boss was a good friend of mine, and he noticed in the paper that there was going to be a political rally for the Mondale Ferraro presidential ticket. And it said, "I'm surprised you're not there. I know you like this kind of stuff." Well, I went, and I ended up volunteering to distribute campaign literature in my neighborhood. And then read a little ad in a local paper that this group, the National Women's Political Caucus, was holding a political skills training session on one Saturday. So, and it's free, right? That's good. That's the right price. So I go to the session on a Saturday. And in the afternoon, it was good. It was interesting. I was learning new things that I didn't know about planning campaigns and strategy and all that. In the afternoon, after lunch, the organizer comes in looking really glum, saying, "I'm so sorry. I have to tell you this. There's been some sort of a mistake, and the person that was supposed to speak to us this afternoon cannot come to the session." She says, "I don't suppose any of you know how to raise money, do you?" Well, that was my job. that was my job for the school. So I raised my hand and I ended up doing the whole afternoon session on how to raise money. And that was the beginning of the whole thing. This is what your counselor will call a transferable skill. Okay. Knowing how to raise money is believe me, it's a transferable skill to just about anything. So from that point in the mid 80s, I did a couple of more volunteer stints on campaigns, some short-term, some, more like full-time stuff. And then I was hired to work on a campaign. And then my candidate lost, but another candidate had been kind of observing me working in that campaign and hired me to work in his state Senate office. And so I was going along with more and more experience, okay, along the way. And I kept checking in with the National Women's Political Caucus and joined them, and was with a local group. And then after a couple of years, I was on one of their board members. And then after a couple of years, I was the vice president. And then I started continuing to train other women on how to raise money in a political campaign. And by that time, I knew more about political campaigns, until ultimately I ran my own campaigns for the United States House of Representatives. And and I was not successful. I had 2 campaigns back to back, and I just barely missed winning those 2 elections. But I went to Washington, D.C. and thought, okay, what's my backup plan here? What's plan B? Well, I went as an appointee, as you've seen in my literature. And when I knew the presidency of the National Women's Political Caucus was coming open, I worked my way towards it in Washington. And I essentially, kind of in a very gutsy way, said, I'm a product of this organization. I started at your little Saturday afternoon training and did the afternoon session before I was even a member. And now I've come all the way through working for campaigns and being a candidate and being a political appointee. I am the next president of this group. And they had election. I was actually running against former members of Congress. But I really pushed the point that I had grown up politically in the organization, and that's how I became president.
Thank you. I think that's very interesting, especially about how you said how you went, just to attend like a small meeting, and it ended up that, I think that it just kind of shows that everything happens for a reason,
Well, it builds on itself. Now, I could have maybe done other things, but it didn't cost me anything to go that afternoon. And I actually ended up contributing to them because of the work that I was doing as a fundraiser. But it probably taught me more of how valuable my fundraising skills were in other arenas that I had never thought of. So there you go. You don't know. I'm not saying, that there's some sort of big fateful plan involved in it, but each time we try something new, we learn in a different way about what the possibilities are. And sometimes you'll run with it and stick with it, like I did in that case. And sometimes you'll say, okay, that was fun. Now I'm going off to do something else, which I've done with any number of things.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You did mention that you have a PhD in human and organizational systems.
Yes.
What does that mean?
What is that? Yeah. Okay. In the old days, in mid-century, 1950s, 60s, 70s, they used to call it organizational development. And even before that, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, 30s and 40s, and before that, they called it organizational psychology. Okay. And it goes all the way back. If you had a basic management class, it would talk about this man named Taylor, who used to study. He had a factory, and he had production lines with employees, on either side of these long tables doing stuff. And he would time them. to see how fast they could do this or that. And then he started experiments, organizational psychology. He started changing the lighting in the factory. Or he started changing like the break bells or the lunch bells or this or that to see, would they go faster if I did this? Would they go slower if I did this? You know, would they talk less if I did this? Would they get angry if I did this? So that whole field of organizational psychology went through a growth period where people began to not only see what made a productive work environment, but thank God, more graciously, what really helps the employees, not just the employer, right? Until finally, in the 21st century, we now are much more respectful of the employees themselves. And this is organization, we study organizational systems and human systems, okay? What makes for a good working group, all the creativity, all of the wherewithal that you need to move an idea forward and to move a product forward, to move a cause forward. How do people work together in the most productive way? That's what it's about. And that's how it grew over the decades.
Thank you, because when I had Googled it, I was like, what does this mean?
What
So I was
is
like, let me
it?
just ask, and then I'm gonna.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I would like to ask one question,
Yeah.
and it has to do with the difficulties that you have faced as a woman. Because I'm pretty sure that living the life that you have led, opportunities and situations would have been much different had you been a man. So can you speak to what moments in your life you have seen that being a woman has been an impediment to more success or an obstacle in some way, and how you have overcome it?
Well, there is such a story to be told, and we could tell it either in the single variant way, okay, woman, non-woman, okay, or we could talk in a multi-variant way, or the crossroads where your gender, your time period that you're born in, your community, racial or ethnic group that you are a member of, the crossroads of all those factors, the cross dimensions of all of those have as much of an impact as any one thing, okay? So I'll try to be brief with it. The fact that I grew up as a second generation Mexican American in Southern California in the 1950s and 60s, the youngest in a family of with two older siblings, both female, father working class, blue collar, all of those things had a big impact on me, most of which I had no idea of at the time. Okay. I am, thank God every day that I was very loved and had a lot of interactions with not only my sisters, but all my cousins, about 34 first cousins that lived within 15, 20 minutes of us. So I had a built-in community, okay, and knew my place in it. But knowing my place in it, that's where the limitations start to come in. My place in it was basically to replicate the life of my mother and my grandmother, which was women working at home and caring for children. And I never really had a heart for that. It wasn't anything I ever desired to do. I was always attracted to more adventure, travel. I was just a curious person. The second thing that goes along with that profile is that I believe, I think it's pretty well documented now, is that my teachers and my elementary, probably secondary too, had low expectations of me. So while my education was perfectly adequate, I was a reluctant reader and very, very slow at that, and not to mention other areas of the curriculum. So I was a very, very average student and was never expected to do more and never pushed to do more. Finally, when it came time, when it was possibly time for me to marry, I really didn't want that traditional role. I essentially wanted a co-pilot, not a husband. I wanted somebody that I could travel with and have adventures with and do all this fun stuff. And as I got to be a junior and a senior in college, two things were happening. One is that people that I was getting to know were disappearing, namely because they graduate or they transfer or whatever, and they're gone from your life. And I thought, well, it'd be really nice to have somebody who sticks around and that you could enjoy your life with. And the other thing that was, now I forgot what the other thing was, but that was, but those were my expectations. And I basically spoke with the man who would be my husband about that I didn't have a traditional view of what a marriage would be like, or what our home would be like, or what our life would be like. But I wanted to stick with him, and I wanted us to travel and do things, do different things in life. And it was difficult for my parents to understand the choices that I was making. And it took some talking to help them feel comfortable with that I was doing just enough for them to feel comfortable, but not enough for them to, feel like I was following a traditional model of what they had in mind originally. So that doesn't actually address your question directly, but I know that those were some of the various influences that happened in my life.
Thank you. And I want to make sure that all the questions that Grace, Kamori, Eliana, Alyecia prepared, but I also want to encourage people who have questions to submit them through the chat or through the Q&A. So the next question.
I'm looking over at the chat right now. I put my little lentes on and see that.
Yeah, we don't have questions in the chat yet.
Oh, you don't have questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I just wanted to announce that if there are questions, they can send them in the chat.
Okay. I want to say something about my husband while we're waiting, hoping that comes through. Because one of the things that I don't do enough is say anything about him, because I've done a lot of things in my life, and I end up talking about myself. And that same man that I married in 1972, I'm still married to. Okay, so that's a good long time to be married and in love, and it was terrific. One of the best things that we had a lot of good things between us, but I think one of the best things was that question that came earlier about my values. And we both have a deep faith commitment, and tried, rightly or wrongly, to have that guide our decisions as we've gone through the decades together. And again, it's not to say that it's a particular doctrine or that we are always making the right decision. Sometimes we did some stupid things for the right reason, but we have been together a long time and enjoyed each other and still enjoy one another.
I have a question. So as I mentioned, I am a social work major.
Oh.
And in our social work classes, we are our professors is teaching us how to intertwine clinical social work with policy social work.
Oh, good.
And
Mhm.
a lot of what we talk about in our policy classes is unintended effects of the policy
Mhm.
versus intended effects of policy.
Yeah.
So is there a policy that you know of that has both unintended and unintended effects?
That's a tough one. I can tell you of an international policy that had that. And it was the food subsidies that went to sub-Saharan Africa in the 60s and 70s during a time of tremendous drought. It's actually kind of a famous one that people have written about in the past, but there was a real global rallying because of the drought and famine that was in sub-Saharan Africa. And what was happening was that the farmers were working with the legislators and the international organizations here in the Midwest of our own country and sending corn crop. Great staple and transportable. And so a lot of corn went to sub-Saharan Africa. Well, what was going was our best, which is yellow corn. And as it turns out, at least at that time in their history, the sub-Saharan Africa farmers only fed yellow corn to their animals. And it was their tradition that human beings only eat white kernel corn, not yellow kernel corn. From there, a huge conspiracy theory developed in sub-Saharan Africa that the Westerners were actually trying to kill off the Africans, if not just insult them as if they were animals, sending them this yellow corn to eat, or maybe even infect them somehow. So there is a good intention, a multinational effort, sending a huge donation of foodstuff, which was otherwise, and at least for us in our expectation, very healthy foodstuff, that was rejected, thrown out by the bushel full, because it was first an insult and then a huge controversy and conspiracy about what was going on.
We have one question from Dr. Jessica Keene. She asks, what inspires you as a writer? How do you find space to write? What are your favorite kinds of books to read in your free time?
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. Let me put my writer's hat on now, away from my policy hat, right? Okay. First of all, I am a term I've just recently learned on some of these webinars I've been on, what's called a reluctant reader. I don't know if you were on the call earlier, but I was talking about my early education experience, where it has become obvious to me that there were very low expectations on what I might achieve in education as a young child. And one of them was a real lack of reading experience and expertise. I would go out, run and play with my dog or on my bicycle more than I would ever pick up a book. I don't think I read a book until I was at least 18, maybe 19 years old. And that's not a good thing for a writer, right? I learned this later. If you write, you're supposed to love reading and be inspired by reading. Well, reading has been very, very tough for me. It's part of a high propensity in a dual language home. There's a real high propensity for a dyslexic reaction in your reading when you're trying to learn a second language or trying to cope with a language that's not spoken in your home. So I now know there are a lot of influences on why have never been a good reader. I'm a better reader now than I ever was. And what inspires my current writing is my imagination. My previous writing, 3 books, were nonfiction, and they were basically inspired by my access to people in power and writing about how women can take leadership and power. And that's what I first wrote about from 1990 through 2016. After that, I started having stories coming through my mind, my imagination. And those stories were fueled by volunteer work and visits I was making to colonial sites in my state of California, namely the old missions that were developed by the Franciscan friars prior to statehood, starting in the 1700s. I knew about the friars. I knew about the governors. I knew about the Spanish soldiers. I knew all of those stories, but what I didn't know was who actually did the work. And pulling together my thoughts about the common person, about politics and life that affect people in their everyday life, and these big changes that were going on politically, essentially, in this territory along the Pacific coast, that inspired me to write. That inspired me to learn more about the stories and what had already been published about the history of my state and my coastline here. It inspired me to learn more about my own connections as a Latina woman with roots both in Mexico and Spain, both indigenous and European. That inspires me to write and continues to inspire me to write. I'm having a lot of fun learning more about it and imagining and writing my imaginings down.
Other questions have come in. Ethan Doyle asks, how has being a part of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation impacted your life and how you view life?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. And it's been about almost 25 years that I've been a part of it. They've just recently changed the Woodrow Wilson name on the foundation to being taken over by the Council for Independent Colleges, but it's the same group. And what I found not too many years into this, in the 90s, was that most of the university speakers that this group utilizes come from media and politics, individual in media and politics. Well, I guess I'm in media and politics, but not like these really big names like Cokie Roberts or, people like that have big national, international, names. What I did find was that my experience on working for 4 different colleges and universities gave me a real connection to the smaller campuses like yours, rather than the big, gigantic universities, gave me a respect for the faculty and staff and students that gain their education through these wonderful institutions around the country. So again, it is one of those things where I thought, well, I guess I can do this. I'll try to share my experience. And I find out that part of my experience is really closer to the schools that I speak at, like your school, than a lot of the big speakers who've gone to Ivy League schools or private schools all of their, secondary life. And I'm a public school kid that went to small privates. And I appreciate these schools and I enjoy making that contribution back through the visiting lecturers.
Dr. Scott Bennett from History asks, what impact, if any, did Cesar Chavez and his United Farmer Workers movement have on you?
I would say it had quite a bit of impact because, again, demographically, those were my growing up years when Chavez and others were developing the movement in my own state, California. And so I was very much front and center to see that movement. One of the resulting political groups, a youth group called the Brown Berets, was on my very campus when I went to the community college in East Los Angeles as a freshman and a sophomore. One of my early employers, the state senator here in California, and we worked with him on riding with the huelga, the flag, for the farm workers in the parades that we did in our community before he really understood what the flag was, but I knew what the flag was, and we got that flag in the car with him, and we're representing the laboring people of the state until fast forward 20 years forward, and I'm at a Democratic National Convention as a candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives from this district, and in what they call the green room. You're waiting to speak to the convention. And next to me in the green room was Cesar Chavez. And it was pretty amazing to have a little speck on the wall starting out, seeing and knowing about him and his work, and then working with others to support his principles and the movement in general. And then finally, you're going to speak at the same podium as this man. It was a wonderful, almost like a spiritual experience. He was a very humble person. And you don't find a lot of those at the political conventions. So it was very, very genuine and quite an honor.
Amazing. Student Sam Thumbs, he says, hello, I'm an international student and heard about you through my Gen 101 class.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of any ways to get involved in politics in the US?
I know a million ways to get involved in politics in the US. I mean, there are, first of all, as a good professor, you say, well, let us define our terms, Sam. The first term we want to define is politics. The second term is get involved. Okay? So if we define politics as campaigns and elections, there's one route to get involved in campaigns and elections. If you define politics as policy making or the legislative work of actually helping to promote or craft legislation or new rules at a local, county, state, or federal level, that's another type of political work that you're involved in. You could also be involved with the judiciary or the court system. There are all sorts of ways to define politics, and to know what part of it you are drawn to is one of the first things. Then the second, how to get involved, would be to assess your own skills. What are the skills that you bring to any involvement? Is it a skill as a student that you're great at researching and writing? Is it a skill of being able to pull people together and get them enthusiastic about an idea or a cause? Okay, rallying people together. Is it a skill that you are able to technically help with the distribution of information or procedures that will help in the political process? So you want to define your terms. Where do you want to enter into politics? What do you have to offer? And then you begin to narrow it down on how to get involved. We can talk more about that during the week if we're going to meet together some more.
Okay. Also, Maureen Rutolo asks, what is a fun fact about you that people might not know?
Oh, well, you already missed the first fun fact. That's that I'm a Zumba teacher. Okay, so we're going to start moving around here sometime during the week. I became a certified Zumba instructor about 10 years ago, and I teach various classes, and it is a very fun fact. It's a fun thing to do. I do it for exercise. I do it again for encouraging people to stay healthy, to remain healthy, and to appreciate music that comes from Latin American source that gives great honor to my culture.
Thank you. And we have time for a couple more questions from our student interviewers. So I don't know who would like to go next.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Dr. Ferguson, did you experience ostracization because of being bilingual? If so, how did you handle it?
Okay. Well, first of all, I grew up monolingual, English, and my parents and my grandparents all spoke Spanish in my home. I am the youngest of 3 kids, and my oldest sister grew up not quite bilingual, mostly in Spanish until she entered school. She had some horrific experiences. She took the brunt of it, as they say, for us, right? She entered school speaking mostly Spanish and got in a lot of trouble, had a lot of issues there, not only with her teachers, but the kids were pretty rough on her. And so at that point, when I was just still an infant, my parents decided we're just going to have the kids speak English only. So that's why she grew up speaking Spanish. I grew up speaking English, as well as my other sister. Now, later on in my life, when I started to use Spanish, I knew a lot of what I now know grammatically are called the command tense things like déjalo and siéntate and cállate and all those kind of little phrases, right? Because that's what I would hear at home. But I knew nothing about real vocabulary or real grammar in Spanish, much less Spanish literature. So I started to learn more of those things as an adult. During the week, I know that when we were with the Avanzo group later, I'll tell you a funny story about making a horrendous Spanish mistake on international television live with this woman out of Florida that has a talk show called Cara a Cara. And she is like, "Habla tan rápido," right? She speaks so quickly, and I made a really bad goof on her show and turned around my Spanish after that the hard way. I'll tell you more of that story later. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure.
I have a question that kind of has to do with that, that area.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, like, how do you feel that your upbringing as a Hispanic child was different in comparison to your non-Hispanic peers?
Again, it is that several factors that are involved. I could say it was because our family was a Latino family that we did this or we did that, but because we were also in a lot of other demographic categories that we did certain things. I mentioned my father was a blue collar worker, right? We had a limited budget. We always ate. And as a matter of fact, my parents bought their own home. Little did I know they had to go to court to get into the housing tract that they were in because they didn't allow Latinos in that housing tract when my parents went to buy that house. But I was too young to even know that. I had to read about it like decades later to understand that. So there were influences on my life that were in many ways limiting me that I didn't even realize while I was younger. I think the biggest influence was the low expectation that I had from so much of my public school experience. My teachers not expecting a lot of me, okay, because of who I was. And then later, because I was a public school kid, the university not expecting a lot of me because I was one of those public school kids. Okay. And then later, the higher echelons in political life not expecting a lot of me because I didn't go to Ivy League school. Okay. So there's a whole mix of factors in how we experience life, a part of which is our racial or ethnic identity, and a part of which is our socioeconomic location and other things. We'll talk about this in a couple of classes with a book I love called Social Stratification in the United States by a demographer called Stephen Rose. It's really a good book. Mhm.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Very interesting answer. Thank you.
So I have another
Okay.
question. So back to your leadership roles and everything that you've led so far, what guidance would you give to future female professionals who belong to minority groups who aim for leadership roles in their career?
Well, I would say that there's some things that would be very similar to what I'd say to anybody, male or female, whatever race or ethnicity they are that's preparing for leadership. Those are all about your ability to not only learn your craft and your area very well, but be confident in that and learn how to exude your confidence. One of the ways that I find is the most helpful in exuding confidence is what some kids used to call your posse, right? And you may have your colleagues at work, and you may have your fellow students at the university, but you always need those nitty-gritty friends who you can say anything to, who will support you no matter what, who knew you when you were young or in other circumstances, to have that fullness of support throughout your lifetime that gives you the confidence to move forward. I say that particularly to people who come from an underrepresented group in the professions, okay? Because when you walk into a room where nobody looks like you and nobody sounds like you need to have the backup morally and spiritually in your life saying, I know I'm loved. I know I am respected. And I know I can just face this group, even though they don't know me and they don't look like me, but I've got what it takes to do the job that needs to be done. It gives you that extra confidence, because it's very likely that the first time you step into that room, it's going to be unnerving. And maybe even the last time that you walk out of that room, you will have no more friends in it than when you came in. It's possible. As long as you have that grounding of friends and family that's behind you, no matter what, that knew you when, then you've got the confidence and the wherewithal to move forward. Hang on to your buddies.
Thank you so much for that amazing advice. Thank you.
I think I needed that. I think I needed to hear that. My last question is, you talked about how during this pandemic, you've been doing a lot of reading. Is there any books that you would suggest for, I know that the Council for Diversity and Inclusion is doing a book read on Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. Is there any books that you would recommend that speak to diversity or minorities?
Well, mostly I have been reading young adult books, namely high school type books recently, because that's the category that my book falls into, that my book was read for YA, young adult. So that's what I've been reading. I have a box right down here that I pulled. I have an old one and a not so old one, okay, that come into the category you're talking about. What the old one is by somebody, I hope you all know, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Gloria's Borderlands, or La Frontera, is a terrific book. I think really speaks to a lot of larger issues that are a cross section of racial and ethnic crossroads and differences, especially for people moving forward from the territory where they were born and how they move through society. The other is Double Outsiders, How Women of Color Can Succeed in Corporate America. This is Carter's book, Jessica Carter. I can hold it up so you can see it. There you go. Jessica Carter also does a tremendous work, but she's really looking very specifically at professional corporate lives and women that come from racial ethnic minority groups and how to navigate through that particular world. Those are two that I would recommend right now.
Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I believe those are all the questions that we had for you. I appreciate your time. Thank you, Grace, Kamori, Eliana, Alyecia, and of course, Dr. Anita Perez Ferguson for your time tonight. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight for this introductory interview to get to know Dr. Anita Perez Ferguson. Dr. Perez Ferguson, do you have any message to give to the campus this first night that you get to know us?
Well, the first night, it's the beginning of the week, and I know all weeks are tough for you. So squeezing in something extra, I really appreciate you being here. And I want to commit to giving you as honest and forthright answers as I can all week long as we meet together. And I also have the opportunity to see how links come together in life when we least expect it. And I want to be sharing that with you again and again. There may be something you thought you would be doing by this time in your life. There may be someone you thought you would be with at this time in your life. There may be something that you thought you would believe in at this time in your life, but things change. Things change and it's still okay. So how do we go forward, make the right decisions and the right choices to do the next thing and to make a difference in this world? That's what we'll talk about all week.
Thank you very much. That's a great way of ending tonight. So thank you, everybody. And we'll be seeing Dr. Anita Perez Ferguson throughout the week. Good night.